It really feels like we're living in a year where every single news cycle is just, I don't know, a fresh coat of political varnish slapped onto a decaying structure.
Totally.
You log on, and the headlines are all about instability, protests, corruption, but it's all delivered with this, like, weird digital hum of official denials and just
Yeah.
curated noise.
It's that constant grinding tension, the
Yeah.
tension between the polished facade of global governance, the systems, the laws, the institutions we're supposed to believe in,
Right.
and then the raw, unedited reality on the street. We're doing a deep dive into 2025, a year that, globally, is really being defined by systemic distrust and widespread resistance.
Yeah.
And what's genuinely unsettling isn't the chaos itself, it's how fundamentally familiar it all feels.
I have to agree. That's what we're asking today, right? Why does this current moment of global instability feel like we're just reading a script that was written decades ago? Because structurally, the warning manual was already written, and it was delivered with like unparalleled insight and this visceral anger by one of the greatest cultural icons of the last 30 years.
He knew.
He knew the system was fundamentally designed to break, and he absolutely refused to be quiet about it.
That's exactly our mission. This is a deep dive of Vivid Voices media production. And we're focused on extracting truth from sources that the mainstream either ignored or, demonized.
Stories once considered too real, too complex, or just too uncomfortable to tell.
Exactly. We're connecting sources on immediate global political collapse, specifically the Gen Z-led protests in Bulgaria against what they call the informal powers, with the foundational revolutionary art and philosophy of Tupac Shakur.
Okay, hold on. I know some listeners might be thinking, Bulgarian anti-corruption movements and 90s West Coast hip-hop.
Right.
That seems like a massive conceptual leap. Let's break that down right now. What is the precise structural element that makes these two struggles basically identical, not just analogous?
And that's the critical question, right? We're seeking the common ground between real-world authoritarianism and cultural rebellion. The sources reveal that the problem isn't regional, it's systemic.
Ah.
Both narratives, from the streets of Sofia to the lyrics written in the early 90s, they both point to a world where the official rulebook isn't just occasionally broken, but it's fundamentally, institutionally disregarded.
So the betrayal is the constant. Tupac always insisted that the oppression he fought, the police violence, the economic neglect, it wasn't some isolated incident.
No, it was the system.
It was a deeply embedded system. The system works by trapping people.
Precisely. We're unpacking the reality of America's nightmare and discovering how precisely that nightmare, built on institutional malpractice and economic exploitation, went global.
Wow.
And is now manifesting in crises across continents. That thread connecting a Balkan nation to the philosophical core of revolutionary Black American art, it's tighter than any diplomatic agreement you're ever going to find.
Okay, so let's start with that immediate global reality of systemic failure. The epicenter of the youth frustration we're tracking right now is Bulgaria. And this isn't just a protest against a single policy. This is a decade-long crisis of institutional betrayal. We're talking about a country that has been in this prolonged state of political instability since the mass protests in 2020.
Right, the protests against entrenched corruption and what is known as state capture.
Exactly, state capture.
And state capture is really the crucial term for understanding modern authoritarianism. It just means the state's formal institutions, parliament, courts, ministries, they're being manipulated by private interests for their own benefit.
So it's all a show?
It's all a show. And the 2020 protests, while they were massive, they didn't solve the problem. They just triggered a cycle of repeated, often failed elections and perpetually unstable, short-lived governments.
Since 2021, Bulgaria has held how many parliamentary elections?
1.4 in 2 years.
4 in 2 years. And yet no political settlement has lasted or delivered the integrity that people were demanding on the streets. It just speaks to a deep underlying fracture that the electoral process alone, especially when it's controlled by these external informal interests, it just cannot possibly fix.
The system is structurally compromised.
Yes.
And that instability creates this massive public exhaustion, which is then often leveraged by the very power structures the protests were trying to dislodge in the first place.
It's a feedback loop.
It is. And the most recent, and I'd argue the largest protests since the post-communist transition, were sparked by the December 1st catalyst.
And that catalyst was a controversial 2026 budget proposal. The proposal raised taxes, and the public saw it as being designed primarily to fund higher wages for the public sector.
Which just favors the politically connected.
Exactly. And while the economic pressure was the immediate trigger, I mean, you have people struggling with inflation now facing higher taxes, the analysis from the Bulgarian Center for Not-for-Profit Law, it emphasizes something much, much deeper.
They argue the protests were primarily centers on values. And this is the key insight we really have to extract.
Right.
People weren't just mad about money. They were reacting to the fact that democratic rules were being openly disregarded and that governance was increasingly being shaped by informal powers and personal interests.
It's that moment when you realize the democratic contract is a sham. The real decisions are all being made in back rooms.
Yes.
I have to push back a little, though, because informal power can sound so abstract. Who are these people? You can actually point directly to the two figures at the center of public anger.
You can.
And they embody these deeply entrenched yet informal power structures, and they operate in completely different ways.
That distinction is so vital for understanding how modern corruption works. First, you have Boyko Borisov, the former prime minister who has dominated Bulgarian politics for, over a decade? His power is visible, it's populist, his image is built on this strongman rhetoric, often involving highly visible, aggressive policing actions and promises of order.
Right, the strongman.
He retains a loyal, conservative voter base, despite major international and domestic corruption scandals. He represents the visible face of the security state that promises control in exchange for, just ignoring the law.
And then you have the far more insidious figure, Dilian Pievsky. He's the total opposite of the strongman.
He really is. He represents a deeply entrenched form of political power that's more oligarchic and hidden. Pievsky's influence stems from media control, vast financial holdings, and just the ability to dictate policy from behind the scenes.
So when you put them together, they symbolize the true reality. The country isn't being run by the Constitution or the rule of law.
Not at all.
But by a dual system. One visible, one hidden, and both are dedicated to backroom deals and personal agendas. This, structurally, is the very definition of systemic capture.
And the people see it. They see that the formal democratic process is simply a tool for these informal powers.
So when the civil society organization, the CSOs, the independent groups, journalists, activists, when they start doing the work the government should be doing.
Challenging corruption, documenting the betrayals.
Right. What does the system do? It tries to discredit or intimidate them, often by importing authoritarian tactics from elsewhere.
We saw proposals introduced by politicians resembling foreign agent laws designed to restrict funding and label these organizations as foreign threats.
Which is so ironic.
It's incredibly ironic because these attempts didn't silence the CSOs. They inadvertently highlighted just how influential and necessary those CSOs had actually become in pushing back against this institutional betrayal.
So the system tries to label the truth tellers as foreign agents.
Which only confirms that the true agents of corruption are domestic.
That systemic disregard for the rules in Bulgaria, it leads us straight into the second global crisis, the erosion of objective truth itself. Because when the formal rules disappear, facts are next.
And the erosion of truth is terrifying, because it's not passive. It's an active demolition of our shared reality.
Yeah.
The RAND Corporation defines this as the critical decline in the role of objective facts in public discourse. This isn't just about disagreeing on policy.
No.
It manifests inconsistent interpretations of major events, the dissemination of alternative, state-sponsored narratives, and, most critically, the development of deep, persistent, and often justified distrust toward official sources of information.
And what really stands out to me is that this erosion isn't an accident. It's a manufactured political tool.
Absolutely.
Modern psychological operations and competitive political struggles, they rely on the manipulation of mass consciousness as a key element. When we talk about fake news, we often think of, bloggers in a basement or something.
Yep.
But the most effective propaganda flows naturally from the highest concentrations of money and power.
We need to unpack that mechanism, though. Why does power naturally generate propaganda?
Well,
because power concentrations, oligarchies, corporate interests, entrenched political structures, they have a vested interest in maintaining the status quo, even if that status quo is fundamentally unjust or corrupt.
so the narrative of the status quo is engineered to support systems and cultures that concentrate wealth and power.
Yes.
So the ruling class is essentially just creating an alternative reality where their actions are always justified, or at the very least obscured. We are constantly gaslit into believing that we share in the spoils of prosperity, when really, we're just cheap labor. We're the ones dying in the conflicts while the ruling class profits exponentially.
The truth is just inconvenient to the power structure, so it has to be neutralized.
And when political and economic power is this centralized, and when objective truth is this fragmented, the human cost is always amplified.
Always. This structural failure acts as a risk multiplier for violent conflict, both internationally and domestically. The revival of authoritarianism and populism across Western societies, as detailed in recent global schism analyses, shows that the fraying of democratic norms isn't confined to transitional states like Bulgaria.
No, it's a global structural phenomenon.
It is, and it's rooted in economic inequality and centralized power.
And the terrifying implication is that when the basic norms of civility and law dissolve, and when institutions are captured, the sheer volume and nature of the violence inflicted, it demands an entirely new vocabulary just to describe it.
Look at the current situation in Gaza. Researchers and humanitarian workers have detailed the necessity of several new terms because the violence extends so far beyond what is conventionally described as civilian casualty or collateral damage. It's a deliberate, systematic destruction of the very foundations of civilian life.
Let's slow down here. We need to define these concepts because they can sound like sensational jargon, but they are critical academic concepts that describe new forms of structural violence.
Absolutely. The list starts with herbicide, which is the systematic destruction of cities, making them uninhabitable not just through bombing, but through the targeted demolition of infrastructure necessary for urban life.
Okay.
Then there is domicide, the systematic destruction of housing units, often targeting specific communities or entire neighborhoods, making return impossible.
And that distinction, herbicide versus domicide, it's crucial. Herbicide hits the collective city structure. Domicide hits the personal, fundamental right to shelter and return.
Exactly.
What else is on that devastating list?
You have sociocide and politicide, which describe the attempt to erase the social and political structure of a people. So you're targeting leaders, community organizations, and the means for a society to function autonomously.
Wow.
Then there is scholasticide, which is the systematic destruction of schools, universities, and centers of learning, effectively erasing the future intellectual capital of a population.
And finally, meticide.
Meticide is the deliberate, systematic attack on all aspects of healthcare, hospitals, ambulances, medical personnel, supply lines, with the intent to completely wipe out the ability of a community to provide or receive medical care.
That litany of destruction, the systematic wiping out of every single aspect of civilian life, from home to education to health, that tells you everything you need to know about what happens when norms completely fray. We aren't just seeing destruction, we're seeing a total collapse of the protection architecture. The violence is structural, not incidental.
This is why Palestinian legal scholars argue for understanding Nakba, the catastrophe of 1948, not just as a historical event, but conceptualizing Nakba as a structure or an overarching frame.
Which is ongoing.
It suggests that this level of violence is built into the system itself, continually manifesting through institutional malpractice and structural design. It's not a memory of the past. It's the present reality being dictated by the framework established in 1948.
And if that's the structural failure and the human cost overseas, the domestic economic reality shows the exact same system favoring the powerful. Let's look at the U.S. economy. We constantly hear about recovery, but when you look closely, you see the K-shaped growth dynamic across income quintiles.
The K-shaped recovery is a perfect mathematical illustration of systemic favoritism. Just imagine a capital letter K. The upper arm of the K represents the wealthiest individuals and corporations. Their wealth just shoots up dramatically.
Sure.
The lower arm, however, represents the working class, the marginalized, and low-income families. Their wages and wealth either flatline or they actively decline.
So if you're already wealthy, the system accelerates your gains, and if you're struggling, the system structurally ensures you fall further behind. It's not just inequality, it's an institutional design flaw.
It is.
It reinforces this idea that systems are inherently structured to favor the powerful while marginalizing the rest, whether that marginalization is through poverty, economic exploitation, or lack of stable housing.
These are all just symptoms of the same disease. Whether it's the two power brokers in Bulgaria subverting democracy for profit, or the necessity of coining terms like herbicide, or the K-shaped economy dividing Americans. It's a global structure where formal institutions serve informal power and personal interests.
And this brings us right back to the prophet, Tupac Shakur, who saw this entire blueprint, this institutional rot laid out over 30 years ago, and articulated it with a clarity that still shocks us today. Tupac Shakur's life wasn't just influenced by injustice. His entire existence was, an extension of the Black radical tradition. His artistry wasn't some phase, it was a direct continuation of his mother's pedagogy.
To understand Tupac, you have to ground his identity in his matriarchal radicalism, specifically his mother, Afeni Shakur. She was a central figure in one of the most famous and, frankly, complex legal cases in U.S. history, the Panther 21 trial.
Right.
She's accused of planning bombings, pregnant, malnourished, and facing a potential 300-year sentence. Yet she studied the law, successfully defended herself in court, and won her acquittal in 1971.
And that is the foundation of his revolutionary genesis. This wasn't just some political affiliation. This was personal, high-stakes resistance and vigilance. When he was born, friends of the movement visited the house day and night. He was immediately exposed to the constant agitation, the political theory, and the intense activity of activism and community building.
Afeni's activism became a kinship practice, rooted in resistance. She taught him to constantly challenge the system, whether it's through fighting educational inequalities, poor housing conditions, or police harassment. Her core ethos, as she recalled, was about survival and defiance.
Like that feeling.
A feeling that said, don't let this happen to you. She gave him revolutionary vigilance as a birthright.
And that early political education, it shows up immediately in his music, long before the mainstream success. Listen to Panther Power, one of his earliest solo recordings. He wasn't subtle. It was a direct, searing critique of the false promises of the American dream.
He spat lyrics that cut right to the core of institutional betrayal. He says, Lady Liberty's a hypocrite. She lied to me, promised me freedom, education, equality, never gave me nothing but slavery. He recognized that the American dream wasn't meant for him. It was a structural delusion, masking historical and ongoing oppression.
But the reality of his political lineage forced this creed of deep personal distrust on him, something that was cemented by the intense, relentless FBI surveillance that targeted his family.
Right.
When his stepfather, Mutulu Shakur, a key Black Liberation Army figure, went into hiding after Assata Shakur's prison escape, the houses where young Tupac and his sister lived became constant targets of surveillance and raids.
Just imagine growing up knowing the government views your family as the enemy. That's not some abstract fear. That's daily kinetic anxiety. Afeni responded by adding crisis control and constant vigilance to his daily lessons.
This is where we get one of his most powerful, defining directives.
Every single morning before she left for work, she would seriously instruct him, often in Portuguese, which was the language of resistance and secrecy within their circle. She'd say, preste muita atenção a cada coisa acontecendo ao seu redor o tempo todo.
Pay close attention to everything happening around you all the time. Total awareness.
And then the crucial, devastating part. Non confia em ninguém. Do not trust anyone.
Wow.
That directive, born of necessity and survival in a hostile state, it shaped his entire consciousness. It created this conflicted but highly aware individual revolutionary vigilance mixed with the conduct and competitiveness of street life.
And that combination resulted in what he called the real model philosophy, which is so distinct from the polished, often hypocritical role model.
Yeah.
He wanted to reflect the reality of living in both worlds, surviving the streets, which required a certain aggression and paranoia, and navigating the music business, which required calculation and savvy.
He believed he had been given voltage by God, and he had to use that power, that shine, to repay the blessing by forcing society to confront uncomfortable truths, even if it meant being controversial.
His famous statement encapsulates his whole revolutionary ambition. I'm not saying I'm going to rule the world or I'm going to change the world, but I guarantee that I will spark the brain that will change the world. His role was to illuminate the path for others.
And that transition from Panther Power intellectualism to holding up the mirror to society via his art is where his work becomes truly revolutionary. And of course, where the backlash began.
He always pushed back against the criticism that he was promoting violence. He famously described his work as caution tales.
Yes.
He insisted he wasn't creating violence, but rather reflecting the violence that was already there, holding up a mirror to a society that didn't like the truth he was showing them.
And that's the core difference between a social critic and a criminal.
Yeah.
Like, it's just easier for the establishment to call Messenger violent than to fix the violent systemic poverty and police brutality that created the reflection they see in the mirror.
And nowhere is that societal failure clearer or more devastatingly articulated than in his early masterpiece, Brenda's Got a Baby.
Ugh, that song.
He took a simple, often ignored newspaper story about a teenage mother and spun it into this devastating epic that critiqued the failure of the community, the family structure, and the welfare system that just leaves marginalized people to suffer and die.
The song perfectly encapsulates the idea of systemic neglect. When he raps, Brenda's barely got a brain, a damn shame. The girl can hardly spell her name. He immediately pivots the blame away from the girl's individual failing.
To the systemic forces that failed her.
Exactly. The family cares only about the welfare check. The molester goes free, and the system ensures she doesn't even know she can grow beyond her confined ghetto existence. She throws the baby in the trash, not out of malice, but out of total desperation and lack of options.
That is a critique of structural despair. And his experience wasn't just observational, it was kinetic, physical. His debut album, Tupacalypse Now, released in 1991, featured Trapped, where he confronted police brutality and harassment head-on. This was not philosophical theorizing.
No, it was lived reality. He was brutally beaten by Oakland Police Department officers after jaywalking just a month before that album hit shelves. The lyrics weren't creative hyperbole, they were documentary evidence.
And the song directly addresses this state-sponsored terror. Can barely walk the city streets without a cop harassing me, searching me, then asking my identity. Hands up. Throw me up against the wall. Didn't do a thing at all. I'm telling you, one day these suckers gotta fall.
They got me trapped in my own community. He saw the police not as protectors, but as an occupying force. A gang of motherfuckers dressed in blue slacks.
And when he defended his more aggressive lyrics about police conflict, he insisted he wasn't issuing a call to violence.
No, he was voicing the intense hate, that frequent, aggressive, dehumanizing police treatment, being sweated, hunted, and harass-planted in young black men. He said he wasn't rapping about making peace, because that was a dream distant from the reality of his community.
He was documenting a constant state of low-intensity warfare.
And that documentation of war, rather than some romanticized version of black life, brought the full force of the white establishment down on him, resulting in a severe moral panic.
That moral panic just exploded, and it was fueled by political opportunists looking for easy targets. Vice President Dan Quayle specifically called out Tupacalypse. Now, after a Texas trooper was shot by a suspect who allegedly listened to the album.
Right. Quayle called the music irresponsible and stated it had no place in our society.
But the media were active collaborators in this demonization, primarily through decontextualization. We analyzed the famous line from Soulja's story, "I choose dropping the cop." That single violent verse was constantly isolated in media coverage to demonstrate his innate belligerence and criminality.
Yet they consistently failed to provide the context that demonstrated his artistic intent. Tupac was rapping that line in a deep, monotone, uncharacteristic voice. He was playing the role of Soulja, a fictional character consumed by anger toward a perceived oppressive system.
The violence wasn't Tupac's natural voice. It was the voice of the nightmare he was reflecting.
And they conveniently ignored that he returned in the final verse in his own conversational tone to offer different perspective. They just divorced the art from the critique.
And that distortion, it highlights a fascinating structural divide in how the media processed his message. When scholars analyzed the newspaper coverage, focusing on 35 total negative articles, the results were split.
60% of those negative articles actually appeared in African-American newspapers versus 40% in national papers.
And that split is so deeply revealing.
It is. African-American publications often focused criticism on his lyrics and lifestyle, reflecting complex internal community debates about responsibility, representation, and the path forward for black youth.
So they were arguing about whether thug life uplifted or degraded the community.
Exactly. While the national media, however, focused almost exclusively on the fear, the threat he posed to the status quo, the police, and the white establishment.
It confirms that the black community was having a nuanced internal conversation about their future, while the white establishment was having a simpler external conversation about control.
Posthumously, this narrative control continued, but his mother, Afeni, successfully leveraged his art to rewrite his legacy.
She did.
She ensured his work and influence would continue, self-crafting his image through approved mediums like films, documentaries, and stage plays.
She effectively turned him into a deleb, a dead celebrity, whose fame and influence increased dramatically after his death.
And this allowed her to control the message of her son, stripping away the tabloid noise and reinforcing the revolutionary core. The system silenced the man, but his mother ensured the message became immortal.
Which is the ultimate win for the revolutionary. He achieved what he always strived for, becoming a legendary writer whose work is still being read, studied, and applied to modern crises. Tupac's life was an exercise in productive contradiction. He was the charismatic, sensitive poet, the trained dancer and actor who wrote these vulnerable, deeply sensitive poems about the pain and yearning he felt.
Hmm.
But he was also the raw, confrontational thug life persona who warned, I ain't a killer, but don't push me.
And that duality wasn't a failure of character. It was an honest reflection of the constant internal and external tension required to survive in that world. He understood that to survive in that war zone, where the police are an occupying force and poverty is structural, you had to embody both sides of the coin. Vulnerability for the sake of art and aggression for the sake of survival.
And this duality, it evolved into an outright specific ideology, which he termed Illuminati.
Hmm.
He coined this term while he was incarcerated, inspired by reading deeply about secret societies, hidden elites, and structures of silent global power over world events. He felt like he had discovered the blueprint for why his community was oppressed.
And the intent behind Illuminati wasn't just paranoid ranting, it was strategic. His goal was to create a direct, unified counterweight to these structures of hidden power, the elite, the powerful politicians, the economic operators, that actively prevented an egalitarian society.
He wanted to focus attention on them.
Yeah, on the politicians who were doing nothing for the marginalized communities, saying he would be sitting in front of every candidate in the next election demanding answers.
That focus on accountability and visibility is so key. The Illuminati was supposed to expose the informal powers, exactly what the Gen Z protesters in Bulgaria were facing decades later.
Exactly. The idea that a few hidden actors are pulling the strings, regardless of what the Constitution says.
And that structural critique naturally led him to push for unity, recognizing that power lay entirely in numbers, not individual action.
He urged Black people to lock it up and get along with Mexicans so that they all have peace on the sets again. He viewed this united power, the marginalized communities recognizing their shared enemy and banding together, as conservative America's worst fear.
That vision of multiracial unity was the ultimate expression of Panther power, applied to the street level. It was recognizing that the oppressed were all fighting the same fundamental system.
Right, the same structure of capitalism and white supremacy that Mumia Abu-Jamal described as engulfing generations of children.
But his incarceration, coupled with the immense betrayal he experienced, being shot 5 times, the sexual assault conviction, which he always denied, feeling abandoned by his friends, it shifted his internal landscape.
It shifted it toward a deep, aggressive cynicism, reflecting the uncomfortable cost of the game.
The post-prison shift is just brutal to track. His survival instincts became paramount, focusing intensely on wealth. His lyrics became more aggressive, demanding, gotta keep my mind on my motherfucking riches!
And he emphasized the constant need for aggression and vigilance. Live the life of a thug nigga until the day I die.
He was paranoid, nervous, and raw. I mean, he had been shot, cheated, framed, and lied to. He viewed life as a constant war zone where trusting anyone was impossible.
He knew he was surrounded by death, saying, I see death around the corner, and my mind on my grind. He was struggling to manage the affection and attention he'd never had as a stable foundation, and that led to volatility.
Yet, contrasted so sharply with this hyper-masculine war mentality was his profound, deeply human yearning for stability and family. This duality of trauma response, aggressive protection, and desperate desire for peace is the core of his tragedy.
We see this most clearly in the emotional juxtaposition with his song Happy Home. He speaks of the hope to turn his house into a stable place, recounting how he fought with his partner but insisted he never hit her, promising commitment despite his current life of crime.
And that anecdote about his brief marriage to Keisha Morris, it's just so human. He aspired to be a husband. He recalled how he carried her across the threshold, telling her, it's how I'm going to carry you across the door when we get married.
Wow.
That image, the hypermasculine thug carrying his bride across the threshold, craving that domestic peace, is the ultimate picture of the man caught between the system he fought and the stability he craved.
And that contradiction, the hypermasculine aggression required for street survival existing alongside a deep, traditional desire for domestic peace. It forces us to consider how resistance should ultimately manifest if the goal is a permanent end to the struggle, not just temporary victory.
And this is where we can bring in the grassroots feminist peace builders counterpoint. If we analyze conflict resolution theory, these groups pursue demilitarized strategies for permanent peace.
Right, focusing on long-term systemic change rather than kinetic retribution.
Their methodology emphasizes inclusivity, local resilience, negotiation, and addressing the root social and economic causes of conflict. They seek to dismantle the systemic structures of violence rather than engaging in a reciprocal war.
Which contrasts starkly with Tupac's kinetic, aggressive concept of war and retribution, where survival required matching the violence of the state. He saw the fight as necessary and immediate.
Whereas the feminist approach sees the fight as long-term structural dismantling, often led by the voices most marginalized by traditional power structures.
But perhaps the highest expression of Tupac's hope, the point where he transcended both the street war mentality and the limitations of his own trauma, was his spiritualized vision, his search for lasting peace.
That vision is encapsulated in Thug's Mansion. It's not a critique, it's a prayer for respite. It's a search for a place better than this in heaven.
A place where the struggle finally ends, where the K-shaped economy and the informal power structures hold no sway.
He pictured being there with Marvin Gaye, Malcolm X, and Billie Holiday, all these figures who are victims of the systemic nightmare he fought, finally finding peace, having transcended the turmoil.
He offered the profound hope that the battle ain't over till the black man sings, hoping that tomorrow could bring heavenly harmony and an end to the ceaseless fight against the machine.
It's the ultimate vision of peace after a lifetime spent at war with the structures that sought to destroy him.
And critically, that yearning for peace is born directly out of the confrontation with the system, not a rejection of it.
So let's wrap up this deep dive. We started with the immediate reality of global political failure in 2025. We detailed the institutional malpractice and systemic fraud we see globally, whether it's the erosion of truth defined by Rand, or the informal powers capturing democracy in Bulgaria, or the catastrophic violence in Gaza demanding a new, devastating vocabulary.
And we end by confirming that the systemic failures Tupac Shakur identified in the early 90s, the corruption, the police violence, the betrayal of the poor, the system being designed to keep the marginalized trapped.
They are the precise structures causing global turbulence in 2025.
Exactly. The economic model that fails its people, the political class that subverts its own laws, and the official narrative that gaslights the masses.
The narrative divides, the propaganda constructed by the ruling class, the centralization of power leading to unbearable human costs. Tupac called it all out from the beginning. He declared, "I am what you made me, America's nightmare."
So when we see Gen Z taking to the streets, not just in America, but in Bulgaria and globally, protesting systems shaped by informal power and personal interests, systems that have openly betrayed their democratic promise, we have to ask the difficult question. Is the world simply experiencing the full, uncomfortable fruition of the nightmare that was never truly addressed?
The violence was reflected in his music because it was already there.
Yes.
The core components of that nightmare, the distrust, the anger, the demand for radical change against hidden power, it didn't vanish just because the music stopped playing.
No.
It metastasized and spread because the system didn't fundamentally change, it just digitized its methods of control.
And in a world of manufactured chaos and eroding truth, where the ruling class spends millions on PR to convince you they are fair and balanced, Tupac's simple, raw advice remains the most radical instruction, the true call to action for every learner, for every protester, for every person trying to make sense of the noise.
Turn off the news and read, nigga. Read, read, read.
That's how you gain the context. That's how you recognize the nightmare when you're living it. That's the deepest dive of all.